Good morning, everybody, dear faculty. Thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure for me to present perioperative outcome parameters for minimally invasive distal pancreatectomy. But first of all, I would like to say thank you to the group of Mark Besselink. They did all the literature searches, they did all the data aggregation, and this was a lot of work. Thank you for that. So as far as I know, I do not have conflicts of interest. And as I said, our topic, which we will have to handle is, thank you, perioperative outcomes of minimally invasive versus open distal pancreatectomy. And since there are two or at least three surgical approaches, as we heard, we have to deal with three comparisons. This is laparoscopic versus open distal pancreatectomy, robot-assisted versus open distal pancreatectomy, and the direct comparison of the two minimally approaches, that is robot-assisted versus laparoscopic distal pancreatectomy. So Mark's group did all the formal literature searches and identified the outcomes of interest of operative and post-operative factors like conversion rate, blood loss, operation time, etc., and also factors of morbidity, mortality, fistula rates, of course, delayed gastric emptying, and so on and so forth. So this evidence out there was identified, and the critical appraisal, the assessment of level of evidence was very easy here, as you will see in the following, because there were no randomized trials. There were only cohort studies and case-match studies, which is, as you know, level 2 and 3 evidence. So they searched PubMed, Embase, the Cochrane library to identify the correct type of procedure and the correct type of approach. And we excluded, and I think this is good, studies reporting less than 10 patients. This is a common technique to get rid of the case, this very small case series and case reports. We excluded also studies that were reported in another language than English. And the last point is very important to me. Excluded were also overlapping cohorts. As you know, there are duplicate or multiple publications out there, and only the largest and one sample was included in these analyses. And we have to deal in the following with a lot of data. I'm sorry for that. And as you can see here, they identified almost 600 original studies, no RCTs, as I said, and there were 52 observational studies, and as I said, 12 case-match studies. These were all on laparoscopic versus open distal pancreatectomy. So this is the largest cohort, the comparison of laparoscopic versus open distal pancreatectomy. These are the cohort studies for this comparison. 42 studies, including almost 18,000 patients, and these are the operative outcomes. Conversion rate, 14%, splenic preservation, higher in the laparoscopic group than in the open group, most likely due to the fact that there were more malignant cases in the open group. Operation time was almost 4 hours in both groups, so no difference here, and blood loss, ladies and gentlemen, was halved in the laparoscopic group, 260 milliliters compared to 550 milliliters in the open group. And as I said, there were case-match studies for this comparison. We did stratification for study design, so these case-match studies were analyzed separately, and I calculated means and medians. And I know this is not the correct type of meta-analysis, but I think for now it's good to digest these data. And as you can see here, these 3,000 patients matched very well with those of the cohort studies. Conversion rate slightly higher with 18%, but operation time, again, almost 4 hours and half of blood loss in the laparoscopic group. So back to the cohort studies, we are still in the comparison of laparoscopic versus open distal pancreatectomy. These are the postoperative outcomes. Major morbidity, 12 versus 17%. I think this is underreporting or underestimation or something in between, because if you count together the rates for BC fistula rate and delayed gastric emptying, you will receive higher morbidity rates as shown here. Mortality between 1% and 3%, I think this is plausible and good. delayed gastric emptying. Again, I do think this is underestimation, 1 and 2% in the laparoscopic and open group. Reoperation rate, 2 and 4%. A significant lower hospital stay of 8 days versus 12 days in the open group, and readmission rates of 9 and 11%. I think this is also plausible. So again, these are the, this is the stratified analysis for the case match studies, and again, these results matched very well, as you can see here. Major morbidity of 11 and 70%, again underestimation, fistula rate between 50 and 70%, delayed gastric emptying 2 and 5%, readmission rates of 11 and 12%. So this is also almost a perfect match. And fortunately, our data from our meta-analysis, which we published in Surgery last year, also matched very well. At this time point, we could identify 29 observational studies, and we showed superiority of laparoscopic distal pancreatectomy in terms of blood loss, time to first oral intake, and hospital stay. All other parameters of morbidity, mortality were pretty much the same, so we concluded that laparoscopic distal pancreatectomy seems to be a safe and effective alternative, and we also concluded that we do not need more non-randomized trials, but a large randomized trial. So there were, this is the next comparison, there were 2 studies which did not define exactly what kind of minimally invasive technique was included in this arm, so they allowed both techniques, robotic and laparoscopic, and so these studies were also analyzed in separate. Conversion rate was slightly higher, 23%, no data for splenic preservation, operation time a little bit higher here, almost 5 hours, and blood loss again was halved in the minimally invasive group, 290 milliliters versus 570 milliliters. Postoperative outcomes within this comparison, I think these are the real rates, 39% of morbidity versus 50%, mortality almost 0. Again, I think an underestimation of postoperative BC fistula rates, 4 versus 9%, no data for delayed gastric emptying, and no reoperation rate, 0 count in both groups. This is almost too good to believe. Hospital stay, 7 versus 9 days, readmission rates, 7 and 6%, all good and plausible. So this is the next comparison. There were 3 studies altogether for the comparison of robotic versus laparoscopic versus open distal pancreatectomy. So 3 studies including all 3 approaches. And as you can see here, conversion rates were higher than in the data shown before, 26 in the robotic arm and 29 in the laparoscopic arm. Splenic preservation, between 20 and 25% in the minimally invasive techniques and 50% in the open technique. Operation time, again, 4 hours in every group without significant differences. But this last point is interesting to me because, as you can see here, blood loss in the laparoscopic group is much higher than in the comparison shown before. You remember the studies, the slides I showed, laparoscopic versus open, and here it is much higher for the laparoscopic group, and this could be a source of bias or the so-called problem of the bad control group, since if you want to show this new technique of the robotic technique in a very good light, your control groups have to be worse. So these are the postoperative outcomes, morbidity between 20 and 30%. This is good and plausible. Mortality 0% and 1% in the open group. Fistula rates 6 and 8%. Again, I think this is underestimation. No data for delayed gastric emptying, reoperation rates, and readmission rates. Hospital stay was best in the robotic arm, and worst in the open group with 12 days. So this is our last comparison, as shown. So this is the comparison of the 2 minimally approaches compared directly to each other, robotic versus laparoscopic distal pancreatectomy. almost 400 patients, 5 studies, conversion rate very low in the robotic arm, 1% compared to 12% in the laparoscopic group. Splenic preservation was even higher in the robotic group, 62% operation time. Again, 4 hours in both treatment arms, no significant differences here. And blood loss was further reduced by the robotic technique compared to the laparoscopic technique. So these are the postoperative outcomes, morbidity rates, 12 versus 12%. I think this is, again, underestimation. Mortality, almost 0%, which is good. And fistula rates of 21 and 70%. I think these are the real figures. Delayed gastric emptying, no data available. Reoperation rate, 3 and 4%. I think this is plausible. Hospital stay 9 and 10 days, also plausible. But implausible, this high readmission rate. We checked these data again, but the paper said, reported these readmission rates of 30% in the robotic arm and 20% in the laparoscopic arm. I cannot explain this. So in order to stay within my time frame, I want to conclude that there's a lot of evidence out there for the comparison of minimally invasive approaches versus open distal pancreatectomy, but generally these studies are very low and there's no RCT available. So we have to conclude that these shown outcome parameters are most likely to be influenced by selection bias, and this is not a problem of these studies itself. It's a common problem of non-randomized trials. But however, as shown, I think the results of the minimally invasive techniques are very promising. I think these are the techniques of the future, but in order to assess them properly, I think we need multinational and open registries to assess these new techniques at a very early stage, and for the technical further developments in registry. This cannot be done in a randomized trial, but to finally assess safety and efficacy, we need a multinational randomized trial. Thank you very much.